Now that we've talked about some of the risks, so we can also look at some of the security controls. One of the security controls we have available is baseline virtual machine builds. So when you build a VM, and this is kind of the nice thing about VMs, is you can build a standard image from which your VMs are created. Microsoft actually does this with Azure. You saw this when you did your Azure lab, right? So in your Azure lab, when you decided to create a 2016 server, and you clicked on the button and it built that 2016 server, it wasn't installing the operating system from scratch. It was taking a baseline image of 2016 server and building it and basically deploying it for you. And it already had some of the settings configured to be optimized for Microsoft's cloud environment. Amazon does the same thing. Google does the same thing. They have various operating systems, just like you saw in Azure. So you can, in those baseline builds, and you can build your own baselines. So in those baseline builds, you can make it so that anytime somebody deploys a virtual machine, it automatically has anti-malware installed on it, and automatically has data encryption enabled and configured the correct way. It has logging already configured. Everything is already configured and ready to go and is already set to your security baseline. So that's certainly a nice control that we have available to us with cloud and virtualization. That's certainly a lot harder to do with our physical environments when you're rolling out or installing physical machines. So access controls, also important. You've got different levels of access, starting with the most basic. You've got access to a building, access to floor, to the actual data center floor, access to a cage or to a rack, and then physical server access. So you can kind of walk through this. We're starting from sort of the 30,000 foot view where here's the whole building. We can control access to that building. And then inside the building, you've got the data center floor, who can access the actual data center. And then once you're in the data center, either you've got racks that are locked or you've got cages of equipment that you would need access to. And then once you get inside a cage or a rack, then you're going to access a physical server. And then within that server, you have the hypervisor to access the actual virtual machine. Now, with a cloud service provider, the first four options here, building, computer, floor, cage, rack, and then physical server access, we don't really have that access with cloud service providers. They control all of that and usually very, very carefully control those things. You'll see that if you watch some videos about Google. Google has some good videos where you can see how they manage all this stuff, and you'll see that we don't really have that kind of control. We don't have this kind of access unless you're in a co-location. So with a co-location, you have a key, you can access your own servers within a co-location for sure. But with cloud service providers, we simply don't have that. What we do have with cloud service providers, where our access control begins, is with the hypervisor. So we have access to some API or to some management plane to begin accessing our machines, and then access to our guest operating systems. We might have to give DevOps access to systems. Customers might need access, database access. Vendors might have to have access, remote control or remote access for employees and vendors and things like that. And then application and software access to data. So then we get kind of lower and lower into these layers as we go deeper into this explanation here. So again, the first four here, we usually don't have a whole lot of control over. And then starting with hypervisor access, that's where we have access to our cloud infrastructure, and we can define all of these different levels of access to our infrastructure. And usually our cloud service provider gives us tools to do a lot of these things. Some of it is available within the operating system itself. Some of it, they have APIs and tools with which we can grant access, or we can control access. So as far as the physical and the environmental protections, there are regulations, policies, and procedures. Certainly, they govern a lot of that. But physical access and to the actual equipment, again, is controlled mostly by our cloud service provider, as well as the security perimeter and all of those sort of physical protections that we talk about in other IT security classes and courses. We're not as we don't have control of those things in the cloud, obviously, but we want to make sure we have an understanding of how our cloud service provider handles those things. And like I said, a good example is that Google video that I've mentioned quite a few times well, there's a lot of videos that Google's put out that you can see how they operate their cloud environments. So some of the controls we have with system and communications, automation of configuration, which I've sort of talked about before, but now that we have with cloud, we have software-defined networking, so we can automate a lot of configuration through software-defined networking. So that certainly opened up a lot of possibilities that that have interesting implications for security. Clearly defining responsibilities between the cloud service provider and the consumer is important. Making sure that you're cognizant of the data lifecycle with the cloud, which we talked about before, how to handle data at rest, data in motion, and data in use. And of course, retention of that data as well, which I left off this slide by accident, but retention of the data is also an important, something important to be aware of. So identification, authentication, and authorization. The device can be allowed to receive an IP address. That's a decision that one has to make. Of course, normally the answer would be yes. Can a web server communicate with a database server? Those types of things that we have to configure in the cloud, very similar to what we would do in our own data center, but we also have to do that with cloud. Can a user access a certain platform? Can an application access an API, like a storage API or object storage API, or APIs with controlling things in the cloud, or content switches and load balancing and things like that can be automated? And the entitlement process basically refers to the rules that determine resource access controls. So what I talked about in the previous slide, so all this stuff, when you make those decisions, you codify those into a list of rules that determine access controls. And again, a lot of times this is happening by through the cloud service provider is making these decisions for you and giving you tools that allow you to configure these things. Now, I would certainly encourage you with your account that you create with Azure for this course to poke around in Azure and learn a little bit about how you can control this access, how you can configure this access, and all of these things you can control. So for example, in the Azure Lab, you had to configure how your web server communicates with the database server. If you recall, that didn't work natively, automatically. It didn't just, you couldn't just connect to any database server in the cloud and start using it. You had to do some network level work to do that. And you were using software-defined networking to do that. You were configuring firewall rules. You were configuring access rules as to who can access the database and from where. So that's a really good example of how that works.